Now that we've kind of discussed the basic backgrounds of what we actually mean when we talk about causality, as well as the different ways in which other variables may impact our ability to make a causal statement, I want to just summarize exactly at this point what we need to show at a minimum in order to make a responsible causal inference. So the differentiation here that I want to make is between an association and a causal statement. With an association, that's pretty much what we're going to be doing for the rest of the semester, quite frankly. We're going to be talking about correlations, contingency tables later in this module, and regression coefficients. Please remember, every time we interpret this, we are going to interpret it as an association and not necessarily as a causation, unless the data is designed in a way that allows us to make that statement. We will only do that if we have some sort of experimental design that randomly assigns a treatment. Otherwise, we're going to solely be speaking about it as an association such that a 1 unit increase in our covariate is associated with a whatever that coefficient increase is in the outcome. In the absence of an experimental design, we will rely on temporal ordering in addition to associations to kind of promote or enhance the notion that we are trying our best, even though the data doesn't necessarily allow us to make some sort of causal statement, or at least cross off different mechanisms that may impact our ability to make a causal statement. So you can imagine, right? It's important for a lot of treatments if it happens in time period 1, time period 2, or time period 3. We can't look at someone's blood pressure a week before they take a medication in T-1 and make any causal statement about how that medication is efficacious, right? That just doesn't make sense. So we're going to kind of use this logic that after this, therefore, because of this, if it happens before in a temporal ordering with regard to a treatment, right? Like if our treatment happens before our outcome, then it can't be a causal statement. And that's going to apply to confounders, right? We don't necessarily have to worry about variables that come after the treatment. In fact, we're going to talk about this in a couple of weeks, how including post-treatment variables is actually going to muddle our results and make our models worse because of the fact that they are post-treatment. Essentially, what our overall goal at all times, regardless of the type of data that we're given, is we want to try to eliminate possible alternative explanations from the one that we're proposing as our main hypothesis, right? So that is going to be incumbent on us to show that there's an association sometimes. That's always going to be the case that we want proper time ordering, but even if those things are true, we may not be able to make a causal inference, right? So what we can do is we can try to test for alternate theories by potentially testing for other mechanisms. And if we can safely cross off those other alternative explanations for why we observe whatever relationship we observe, then we can start thinking about how to make some sort of causal statement. Now, I already talked about one way that we can do this, right? Is we can experimentally control how a treatment is administered. We can use, quote, statistical control, and stay tuned about that. We're going to talk about that when we discuss multiple regression or multivariate regression. But the main thing here is that this is essentially the same thing as accounting for a spurious relationship. We are going to control for potential confounders that would alter or bias the direct estimate of the treatment that or the relationship that we're interested in, which is the treatment on the outcome. And if we can't control these two different things by implementing an experiment or being able to have very robust variables that allow us to control for these potential confounders, then, like I said, we need to think about other types of research designs that allow us to cross off these other potential explanations. So before we move on, I know that I'm throwing a lot of new ideas at you potentially, and I want to really hone in on what I'm talking about by using a couple of concrete examples. And so the first one comes from this study that looked at the association between how much parents help with their kids' homework and outcomes at school. And it found that kids who received more help at home have worse outcomes in school. Ergo, maybe you shouldn't help out your kid as much. And this seems like a really troubling conclusion. And I'd like to use this quote as to why this is problematic. And this comes from a stats test book. But essentially, this is saying that the existence of a relationship does not necessarily tell us what causes that relationship, right? So I want you to think about the results of this study from my perspective, right? If you were me and there were two students that needed help, one of them was getting an A and one of them was getting a C, which of them do you think you should help? You would probably help out the student with a C, just like a parent would help their kid if they were struggling, right? Now, if you're an outsider and you come in and you don't have any measurement of how that student was performing before, you're just going to notice that you spent an entire school year helping one student, and that student may not have improved that much. Maybe that student went from a C to a C plus, right? The student who's getting an A can't really go any higher. So that's a whole nother problem, right? That they're capped at only having a potential decrease. But even just from the perspective of what is causing what here, it's pretty dubious to say that there's any sort of causation between receiving help and having a lower grade, because those students who need help are likely students that are going to receive a lower grade. There's also this second example, which is one of my favorites. And this comes from looking at the correlation or association between chocolate consumption in a year and the number of Nobel laureates per 10 million people in that country. And you can see, we'll talk about this in a week or so when we talk about correlation coefficients, but 0.79 is very highly correlated. The highest would be 1, that would be perfectly correlated. But 0.79 is quite highly correlated. You know something about p-values, so we know that that is a statistically robust or reliable relationship. But this still doesn't necessarily make any intuitive sense, right? Why would chocolate consumption be in any way associated with having Nobel laureates? So I'm sure this is also highly associated with butter consumption, but the two things have nothing to do with each other, even though there is an association. So if you see a surprising result like this, you should immediately be skeptical, because an association does not equate to a causal relationship. Don't fret though, there are instances in which an association is related to a causal relationship based on the way a researcher designs their study. So I want to walk through an example of what it means to do it right. And so I've been kind of talking about the effect that canvassers have on getting out the vote, but there's also strategies that encourage people to vote by sending little note cards that assess their voting record in comparison to their neighbors. Now, an important thing here is that everyone is receiving a note card, so the treatment is not receiving a notification on how they're voting versus their neighbors. Everyone in the study is receiving it. The content of the card is what is changing. So this researcher has made a very important decision to try to avoid going with an intent to treat, or they will use an intent to treat design process, but they've made an important decision here to not take into account, right, like whether or not someone is going to receive the treatment and be confused with a entirely different treatment category, like a controlled treatment that would not receive any notification, right? Like it's important that they are sending a notification to everyone, and the thing that's varying is what's in the message. This allows us to say truly that we have two independent samples. So our data is going to look like this, where we'll have our outcome, whether or not someone votes, 1 yes, 0 no, and our explanatory group is going to be the treatment of maybe high pressure is 1, low pressure is 0. So now that we have two independent groups, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the mean of the group that received the treatment, maybe high pressure, and look at the group that's low pressure. But we need to figure out a way to do that. And that's essentially what we're going to talk about for the remainder of the class here, is we're going to talk about how to compare the means between these two groups to see whether or not there was a change on average between the two treatment groups.